$2. That's all it took for a lonely lumberjack to buy a woman nobody dared to look at. But what he uncovered behind that sack changed everything, and it will break your heart before it even begins. Drop a comment where you're watching from, subscribe if you love these stories, and don't blink, this one's unlike anything you've seen. Spring of 1869 was creeping into Oregon like a quiet promise, but out on the dusty outskirts where I made my living, promises didn't mean much. The outpost was little more than splintered boards nailed to crates, a place where the wind seemed to carry more secrets than words. I was just another rough soul trying to carve some sense out of a world that didn't much care for kindness. That day, the auction was a show men gathered round a rickety stage, their eyes hollow, their hands roughened by axes and saws and hard labor. The smell of dried timber mixed with horse sweat and tobacco smoke hung heavy. I kept my gaze steady, but the murmur in the air was thick, the kind of tension that told me something wasn't right. The auctioneer slammed his wooden gavel down like he was trying to beat the sun out of the sky. "All right, last one for today," he barked, voice ragged. "This one's got no name, no face shown. Got a sack over her head since Missouri, says she can work, says she'll obey. Starting bid $2. Who's brave enough or drunk enough to marry the mystery?" Laughter broke loose. Some joked she might be a witch. Others muttered about curses. I saw men spit in the dirt and turn away, unwilling or unable to face what they didn't understand. But something in me stirred. I didn't care what or who she was. I was tired of the same lonely days, the endless quiet that gnawed at my bones. $2 wasn't much, but it was a start. Without thinking twice, I stepped forward. $2, I said, voice steady. The crowd fell silent like the wind had just died down. The auctioneer squinted and asked if I was sure. I told him, "I'm not buying a face, I'm marrying a person." The sack-covered woman didn't move, didn't speak, but beneath that coarse cloth, I could feel the weight of every fear, every hidden scar. When the auctioneer pressed her for her name, a voice so soft it could have been a breeze through the pines came out. Annabel Crow. Her name hit me like a bullet. Something deep inside shifted a memory I'd tried to bury, a voice from a long-forgotten winter. I signed the papers without hesitation. She was mine now, and for better or worse, I was hers. We left the dusty outpost behind, the forest closing in around us like a sanctuary and a prison all at once. Annabel kept the sack over her head, her posture tight but unyielding. I led the mule with our few supplies, every step heavy with the unknown. Our cabin was small, built from dark pine logs. The fireplace stood cold, waiting for warmth, waiting for us. Inside, she crouched in the corner, silent and still. I set a bowl of stew before her, simple food, made for long days and longer nights. She flinched but ate, each bite careful, as if testing the water before diving in. That night, while the fire sputtered low and the world outside grew quiet, I sat watching her. The sack hid her face, but I could see the woman beneath it, scared, worn, but still there. And in that silence, a fragile hope began to grow. The days after the auction passed slower than I could have guessed. Each one waited with silence and the quiet presence of the woman I had bought for $2. Annabel, the name still sounded strange to me, almost like a secret I wasn't sure I was ready to hold. But every morning she was there, cloaked in that sackcloth like a ghost trying to remember how to breathe. I worked the timberline while she stayed by the cabin. Sometimes I caught her watching me from the window, or kneeling by the fire as if willing it to burn away more than cold. The forest didn't care about names or faces, it only knew survival. And if there was one thing I understood, it was how to survive. Yet survival wasn't what I wanted for her, not anymore. The cabin was sparse but sturdy. The stone chimney looked as old as the land itself, worn by storms and snow but still standing proud. I set up the bed in the corner, stacked firewood just outside the door, and kept my axe sharp, not just for trees but for whatever else might come. Annabel never lifted the sack, except once briefly in the early morning when the light was just shy of gold. I caught a glimpse then. Her face wasn't what the men expected. There was no deformity hiding in shadows, no monstrous scar that would make a man turn away. But there was a mark, a long, curved scar trailing down her cheek, like a secret map carved deep by pain. She noticed me looking and didn't flinch, didn't hide. Instead, she touched the scar gently, as if tracing the memory it carried. That moment said more than words ever could. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. The forest had its own language, in silence, in scars, in the way a shadow clings to the trees. Some nights, I swore I could hear whispers in the dark, not the wind or the crackling fire, but something else. Footsteps soft on the underbrush, a breath caught too quickly, eyes watching from where the moonlight couldn't reach. I wasn't a man to scare easy, but I knew trouble when it smelled like blood and old grudges. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ridges, I found Annabel sitting outside, the sack still wrapped tight. Her hands trembled, fingers fidgeting with the frayed edges. I sat beside her, letting the quiet speak between us. The trees stood still, like sentinels guarding secrets older than both of us. I wanted to tell her she was safe now, but words felt clumsy. Instead, I picked up a fallen pine cone and tossed it lightly into the fire. The sparks rose, little stars swallowed by the night. She watched, eyes reflecting the flames, the same eyes that had saved me 3 winters ago, when the cold had nearly claimed me. That winter, it haunted me. I had been foolish, chasing timber too far north, slipping on ice and falling into a snowbank. I should have died out there, left to freeze beneath the endless sky. But someone had found me, a woman with a sack over her head, her hands steady, her voice calm as a lullaby in the dark. She had wrapped my broken leg with strips of cloth, tended a fire that seemed to burn just for me, poured bitter pine bark tea to chase the fever. She stayed with me through nights so cold my breath turned to glass. And then, as dawn cracked open the sky, she was gone, leaving behind only that embroidered cloth, a small square with purple flowers, stitched in uneven thread. I kept that cloth folded inside my coat pocket, a silent reminder that even in the loneliest places, kindness could be found. I never told anyone about her, not until that auction. Now, here she was, Annabel Crow, the woman I had once known only as a shadow, the woman who had saved my life, hidden behind a sack in silence, the same voice, the same hands, and now, the same cabin. I reached out, but she didn't move away. For the first time, she let me see the scar on her face without flinching. There was a fire beneath those quiet eyes, not anger, not bitterness, but something raw and unyielding, like a wild thing learning to trust again. Still, the past wouldn't stay buried. Rumors started drifting in like smoke on the wind. A bounty hunter named Cutter, lean, cold, and merciless, riding down from the south. Whispers that he was looking for a scarred girl with a sack on her head. Whispers that she had blood on her hands and a lumberman for a shield. I didn't want to believe it, but I could see it in the way the birds stopped singing, the way the wind dropped low before a storm. Trouble was coming, and this time it wasn't just the forest we had to fear. We laid a plan that night. Annabel would wear the sack one last time, not to hide, but as bait. Cutter would see the ghost he was hunting and follow. I would meet him with the sheriff and a couple of Ridge Patrol men, waiting to end this chase. At dawn, Annabel mounted my second horse, the sack tied tight around her head, heart hammering beneath layers of wool and leather. She didn't tremble. She looked forward, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. By sundown, Cutter had taken the bait. The trap was set. When he drew his gun, it was too late. Bound and disarmed, he was dragged away, charged with unlawful pursuit, attempted assault, and intent to kill. Watching from the hilltop, I saw Annabel's form still hidden beneath the sackcloth. When the danger passed, she rode down. Slowly, deliberately, she untied the knot. The sack slipped free, folded neatly, and held like a trophy. She looked at me, no longer afraid. "It saved me one last time," she said softly. "Not because it hid me, but because I chose to use it." I nodded. "And what will you do with it now?" She smiled, then a smile that carried the weight of all she'd lived through. "I'll keep it, not as a cage, but as proof. Proof that even the darkest prisons can become shields when you decide to wear them." That afternoon, when a soft knock came at the door, I knew the world outside was changing, but inside, in that little cabin, something new had begun. The days after Cutter's capture was strangely quiet. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with a mix of relief and waiting. But I knew better. Trouble doesn't disappear just because you bind one man's hands. It only shifts, lurking in shadows, waiting for a new crack to slip through. Annabel moved differently now. The sack was folded and tucked away, but the weight of her past still clung to her like the moss on the old pines. She didn't speak much, and when she did, it was with careful choice, as if words were another kind of armor she had to wear. I watched her one afternoon, sitting by the cabin window, a small mirror balanced on the table in front of her. The glass caught the fading sunlight and threw it back in soft shards, like broken promises made whole again. She reached out, fingers trembling slightly, and touched her reflection. The scar was there, a silent witness etched deep into her skin. It was no secret now, no longer hidden beneath sackcloth or shame, but something had changed in the way she looked at it, not with fear or regret, but with a quiet resolve. I didn't say anything. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. The forest was still in its late spring hush, new leaves unfurling, birds returning to nests, the ground soft with fresh growth. But beneath that gentle surface, I felt the stirrings of old ghosts, the kind that don't rest easy when the past is disturbed. Annabel's story had begun to unravel in my mind, a patchwork of fragments and whispers she never fully shared. The scar was more than a mark. It was a key, a memory that refused to stay locked away. She had once been someone else, a woman caught in a web of lies and violence, betrayed by the ones she trusted most, sold like cattle to pay off debts she never owed, a ghost in a world that had tried to erase her. I thought about the auction, how she'd stood there silent, wrapped in burlap and mystery, how the men had jeered, afraid of what they didn't understand, how I'd stepped forward when no one else would. $2. That was all it took to change everything. But the price was more than money. It was the burden of facing a past that still hunted her. One evening, as the sky burned orange and purple behind the ridges, I found Annabel by the edge of the forest. The sack was back on her head, tied tight as if it could keep the darkness out. She stood still, shoulders squared, waiting for whatever might come. I approached slowly, keeping my voice low. "Do you have to wear that?" She didn't turn. Her voice was soft, barely above the wind. "It's not for hiding. It's for fighting." I nodded, understanding more than I let on. The sack was a shield not from the world's eyes, but from its cruelty. The next day, a rider came into our clearing. A courier from the town, breathless and urgent. He brought news the man who ran the boarding house where Annabel once worked had died suddenly, under mysterious circumstances. Rumors swirled that it wasn't an accident. I felt the weight of it settle like a stone in my chest. The past wasn't done with her. It was circling back, darker and closer. Annabel packed a small bundle, her hands steadied despite the storm gathering in her eyes. She didn't say where she was going, but I knew. She was going to face the shadows head on. I insisted on going with her. We rode through the forest together, the trees whispering secrets only they could understand. The trail was rough, the spring rains making the earth slick and treacherous. At the town, things were different. The streets were crowded with faces I didn't know, voices raised in gossip and suspicion. We kept to the edges, wary of eyes that lingered too long. The boarding house was a crooked old place, smelling of stale beer and broken promises. Inside, the air was thick with tension. People watched us, their gazes sharp and cold. I saw the flicker of fear in Annabel's eyes, but also something fiercer, a spark that refused to be snuffed out. We found the room where it happened. The signs were subtle, a broken chair, a smear of blood barely visible beneath the rug. The story was tangled, but the message clear. Someone wanted Annabel gone, wanted her silenced. That night, we camped outside town, the fire flickering low against the night. Annabel spoke then, her voice rough but determined. "They called me a liar, a killer, a witch. I was sold off, like I was nothing, just to pay a debt that wasn't mine." I listened, feeling the truth in her words burn like fire in the dark. "We're going to fix this," I told her. Not just for you, but for the life we're trying to build. She looked at me then, her eyes steady and fierce. For the first time in a long time, I believed that. The forest waited for us to return. The night held its breath as we rode back, shadows stretching long behind us. We didn't know what lay ahead, but we were ready. Together. Returning from the town, the weight of what we'd learned pressed down hard on me. Annabel's past was no longer some distant shadow lurking behind a sack. It was a living, breathing threat, reaching out with claws sharp enough to cut through the quiet we'd tried so desperately to build. The forest, for all its seeming peace, felt restless. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me tense. I was used to danger. Years in the timberlands had sharpened my senses, but this was different. This wasn't just the wild hunting us. It was something darker, born from human cruelty and grudges that never die. Annabel moved with a quiet strength I hadn't seen before. The sack was gone most days now, and in its place was a determination that flickered in her eyes like a flame refusing to be snuffed. The scar on her cheek, once a mark of shame and fear, had become a testament to survival. She carried it like a badge, a reminder that she was still here, still fighting. I noticed how she watched the forest edges more closely, how her hands would tighten when a shadow passed too close. It was as if she was always waiting for the next storm, the next threat to break loose. One afternoon I found her by the creek, washing the dust of the trail from her hands. The water ran cold and clear, but her eyes were distant, lost in memories I couldn't touch. I sat beside her, the quiet between us, heavy but familiar. "I'm not the woman I was," she said softly, voice barely above the water's murmur. "Not the girl from the auction, not the one who hid behind a sack." I nodded, knowing that was true. The past had tried to break her, but she'd bent without snapping. That was something few could say. "We've got to be ready," I said. "Whatever's coming, it won't wait." She looked at me then, and for a moment the fear was there, raw and real, but it was quickly replaced by steel. "I'm tired of running." The nights grew colder, the fire crackling louder in the small cabin. I worked to keep the woodpile full, the hearth burning steady. Annabel stayed close, the space between us shrinking with each shared moment of silence. She never told me the full story. The boarding house, the man who died, the whispers of debts and lies. But I didn't need to hear every word. The scars spoke louder than stories. One evening, a knock shattered the quiet. It was soft, hesitant like a shadow afraid to cross the threshold. I opened the door to find a man I didn't know. His face was sharp, eyes like chips of ice, hands quick to show he wasn't there for a friendly visit. "I'm looking for Annabel Crow," he said, voice low and hard. I stepped in front of her, feeling the old hunger to protect rise up. "She's not here," I said. The man smiled, then thin, cruel. "You can't hide from what's owed," he said. "Not here, not anywhere." The words sent a chill through the cabin, deeper than the cold outside. He left as quickly as he came, but the threat was clear. Annabel's past had found us again. We spent the night planning, weighing options like men load guns. There was no running this time. If they wanted a fight, we'd give them one. Days passed with tense quiet. Then one morning, the sound of horses echoed through the trees. A small group rode up, faces hard and unfamiliar, eyes filled with the kind of hate that doesn't forget. They were looking for Annabel. I stood at the cabin door, axe in hand, heart pounding. Annabel stood beside me, no sack on her head, no fear in her eyes. "We faced them together," she said. The men dismounted, their leader stepping forward, a tall man with scars of his own, a reputation that stretched like a dark cloud over the territory. "This ends now," he said. The standoff was silent but deadly. The forest seemed to hold its breath again. I thought of the woman behind me, the strength in her stance, the courage she'd found. We weren't just survivors, we were fighters. The first shot rang out, sharp and sudden, breaking the forest's hush. And in that moment, everything changed. The sharp crack of the rifle shot tore through the quiet like a thunderclap, ripping the fragile calm from the forest. The echo bounced off the tall pines, sending a flock of birds into the sky. their frantic wings a frantic chorus to the violence unfolding. I barely had time to react. Instinct took over, axe swinging, heart hammering, muscles coiled for the fight. The men had come prepared, but so had we, in our own way. Survival in the woods had taught me more than just how to cut timber. It had taught me how to read danger before it arrived, how to move like the wind, and how to stand my ground when there was no other choice. Annabel was beside me, steady and fierce. The sack was gone, but the fire in her eyes burned brighter than ever. She moved with purpose, swift and sure, grabbing a heavy iron poker from the hearth and stepping between me and the riders. The first man lunged, a wild shot, missing by inches. The second came closer, blades flashing, but we were ready. The ground was muddy and uneven, but we used it to our advantage, weaving between trees and fallen branches. A shout, a grunt, the smell of gunpowder and sweat filled the air. The fight was brutal and raw, a blur of swinging axes, flying fists, and desperate stabs. I caught a glimpse of Annabel's scarred face, set with determination, as she parried a blow meant for her. The leader of the group, Cutter's shadow, moved with deadly precision. He was calm, collected a serpent in human form. His eyes never left me, calculating, cold. I knew that this was more than a simple pursuit. It was a vendetta. In the chaos, I felt a sharp pain in my side. A knife had found its way past my defenses, slicing through flesh and muscle. I stumbled but didn't fall. Blood seeped between my fingers as I gripped the axe tighter, refusing to give ground. Annabel saw the wound, her face flashing with a mix of fear and rage. She struck the nearest attacker down with a fierce blow, then rushed to my side. "Hold on," she said, voice steady despite the terror underneath. But there was no time for mercy. Another man came at us, and Annabel fought him off with a primal ferocity I hadn't known she possessed. The fight was more than survival now, it was war. The woods were our battleground, the trees silent witnesses to the violence. The men were good, but they underestimated us. Years alone in the wild had forged us into something harder, something that didn't break under pressure. As the sun slipped behind the ridges, the attackers began to falter. Their numbers thinned, their movements slower, less sure. Finally, the leader called retreat, his cold eyes promising this wasn't over. They fled into the shadows, leaving us bruised and bleeding, but unbroken. I leaned heavily against a tree, the pain in my side sharp and raw. Annabel was on her knees, pressing cloth to my wound, her hands trembling only slightly. "You didn't have to fight," she said quietly, eyes searching mine. "I did. For us." She nodded, her face softening for the first time in days. "We're in this together." That night, under a sky strewn with stars, we sat by the fire, the silence between us no longer heavy but full of understanding. I saw in her eyes a new kind of hope, not the fragile kind that shatters at the first storm, but the kind that builds, brick by brick, through fire and blood. The past still loomed, Cutter's men were still out there, and the shadows of old debts and darker secrets followed close behind. But for the first time, I felt like we could face them. Not as broken souls hiding behind sacks and scars, but as two people bound by something stronger than fear. As the fire crackled, I realized this was just the beginning. The real fight was yet to come. The days after the fight stretched long and heavy. My side throbbed beneath the makeshift bandage Annabel had tied with trembling hands, but the pain was a distant echo compared to the weight settling in my chest. We'd faced death together, but the enemy still prowled. Cutter's presence lingered like a storm on the horizon, dark and inevitable. He was more than a man chasing a debt, he was a reckoning, and we were running out of time. Annabel moved differently now. The fragile walls she'd built around herself were cracking, but so was the shelter of silence. Her eyes carried the stories she refused to tell, memories etched deep like scars beneath the skin. One evening, I found her outside the cabin, staring into the dying fire embers, as if searching for answers in the ash. "You don't have to carry it alone," I said, breaking the quiet. She looked up, surprised. For a moment, vulnerability flickered in her gaze before she masked it with a faint smile. "I don't have a choice," she said. "The past doesn't forget, It waits. I nodded. I knew that feeling all too well. The forest never forgets the footprints you leave, and neither did the world beyond it. The next days were a slow unraveling. I watched as Annabel wrestled with herself, torn between fear and the desire for freedom. The scar on her face, once hidden beneath the sack, now stood as a symbol not just of pain but of endurance. She began to speak in fragments, stories slipping through her lips like whispered confessions. The boarding house where she worked, a place thick with shadows and false smiles. The man who thought he could own her, whose death had set these wheels of revenge turning. The lies that branded her a killer, a temptress, a woman unworthy of mercy. I listened, the pieces falling into place, forming a portrait of a woman more brave than most, who walked free. But the more she shared, the heavier the silence grew. One night, as the wind howled outside and the fire sputtered low, she pulled out the old sackcloth. Her fingers traced the coarse fabric like touching a ghost. "This," she said softly, "was my armor, not to hide from the world, but to protect what was left of me." I took the cloth gently from her hands and folded it with care. "You don't need armor anymore." Her eyes met mine, fierce and tired. "Sometimes the world doesn't give you a choice." The forest held its breath, as if it too was waiting for what came next. Days later, news reached us through whispered travelers. Cutter was gathering men, ready to finish what he'd started. The noose was tightening. We prepared, turning the cabin and its surroundings into a fortress born of desperation and hope. Every tree, every shadow became a potential shield or a hidden trap. Annabel was no longer the silent woman I'd bought for $2. She was a partner, a warrior, someone who decided to fight not just for survival, but for the right to be herself. Together, we planned, knowing that when the storm came, there'd be no turning back. The sun dipped low one evening, blood red and heavy, as we sat outside watching the horizon. I saw her take a deep breath, steadying herself. "It's coming," she said, "but so am I." And in that moment, I knew the fight ahead was not just for the woods or for safety, but for the chance to rewrite the story we'd both been forced to live. The forest had a way of swallowing time, making days bleed into nights without warning. But the creeping dread in my chest kept count for me. Every rustle in the underbrush, every distant howl felt like a herald of what was coming. Annabel and I moved like shadows, preparing the cabin and its surroundings for the inevitable siege. We reinforced the door with thick planks, laid traps around the perimeter, and stacked wood not just for warmth, but for fire, a beacon, and a weapon if we needed. She was relentless, her scars no longer a secret but a source of quiet strength. I watched as she moved, every motion purposeful, shedding the fragile fear that had clung to her since the auction stage. One afternoon I caught her standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the thick pines where Cutter's men would come. Her jaw was tight, eyes narrowed against the sunlight breaking through the leaves. "It's no longer just about survival," she said softly, not turning to me. "It's about reclaiming what they tried to take." I nodded, feeling the truth in her words settle between us like the first chill of autumn. The nights grew colder, the wind sharper. Around the fire, we shared stories not just of pain, but of dreams we dared to hold on to. The past still loomed, but we were carving out something new, something real. But peace was a stranger here. One evening, as dusk draped the forest in deep purple, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man, older, face weathered like the bark of the ancient pines. He carried no weapon, only the weight of years and secrets. "I heard you might need a friend," he said, voice gravelly but steady. Annabel's eyes flicked to me, questioning. I shrugged. We had no choice but to trust. His name was Josiah, a tracker and woodsman who knew the land like the back of his calloused hands. He'd seen Cutter's kind before, men who thought power came from fear and violence. Josiah stayed the night, sharing tales of the forest, of survival, of people who'd fought back and won. He showed us hidden paths, safe places where the earth would hide our tracks. With him, the weight on my shoulders felt lighter. We were no longer two isolated souls, but part of a force rising against the darkness. But Cutter was not blind to these moves. The next morning, broken branches and signs of passage marked the trail, proof his men were closer than ever. I looked at Annabel, the fierce woman who'd once hidden behind a sack and now stood tall and unyielding. "We face them soon," I said. She met my gaze, steady as the mountain streams. "Then we fight, not just for us, but for the hope that lives in these woods." As the sun sank behind the ridge, casting long shadows over the cabin, I knew the moment was near. The quiet before the storm, when every breath tasted like iron and every heartbeat echoed in the stillness. And in that silence, I felt something new, not just fear, but the fierce light of a future we could claim with our own hands. The night came cloaked in a heavy silence, the kind that wraps itself tight around the bones and squeezes out every last ounce of peace. We sat by the fire, its flickering light casting long, jittery shadows that danced on the walls of the cabin. Outside, the forest held its breath, waiting, watching, preparing for what would come. I could see it in Annabel's eyes. The same fire that had carried her through years of pain now burned brighter, sharper, but beneath it, a tremor of doubt flickered, hidden deep in the folds of her heart. This night was the crucible, the moment where everything we had built could either break or burn. Josiah stood guard at the door, his silhouette steady and sure. The weight of the rifle in his hands was a grim promise we would fight, or we would fall. I sat close to Annabel, our shoulders barely touching but close enough to feel the tremble in her breath. I wanted to say something, anything to ease the tension, but words felt brittle in the heavy air. Hours passed. The fire dwindled to glowing embers. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind through the leaves set my nerves alight. Then, from the darkness came the first sign, a low murmur, barely more than a breath, but enough to send a shiver through the night. They were coming. Shapes moved between the trees, shadows melting into one another as Cutter's men approached with the deadly silence of predators. I gripped my axe tighter, feeling its worn leather handle bite into my palm. Annabel rose slowly, her hands steady as she pulled a hunting knife from the belt at her waist. The sack was long gone, replaced by a fierce determination that no cloth could hide. Josiah nodded at me, signaling the moment had come. The first attack was swift and brutal. Men charged through the underbrush, guns blazing, but we were ready. The traps we'd laid caught one off guard, a snare that sent him crashing into a tree, groaning in surprise. The air filled with shouts, grunts, and the sickening sound of metal biting flesh. I swung my axe with everything I had, the thud of it connecting with bone, a grim rhythm in the chaos. Annabel moved like a storm, fierce and unrelenting, each strike fueled by years of fury and survival. She fought not just for herself, but for the right to live, to be seen, to exist on her own terms. One of Cutter's men lunged at me with a knife, but I was faster. The blade glanced off my forearm as I brought the axe down in a savage arc. Josiah's voice cut through the noise, steady and commanding, as he fought alongside us with deadly precision. The battle raged for what felt like hours, the forest turning into a hellscape of fire, blood, and shattered branches. At one point, I saw Cutter emerge from the shadows, cold eyes scanning, calculating. He was a snake coiled to strike. Our eyes locked. The past and present collided in that moment. I charged, fueled by every scar and every loss, every breath taken in the wild. The clash was brutal, a tangle of fists, blades, and desperation. Cutter fought with the cunning of a man who believed the world owed him victory, but I was the man who had nothing left to lose. With a final desperate swing, I disarmed him. Cutter fell to the ground, gasping, his empire of fear crumbling around him. The remaining men fled, their courage broken by the ferocity of our defense. Breathing hard, bloodied and bruised, I looked to Annabel. She was watching, her eyes shining with fierce relief and something soft to hope. The forest was silent once more, but we knew this was not the end. Cutter was defeated, but the shadows of the past would linger. That night, as we tended to wounds and whispered prayers into the dark, I realized something. We had not just fought for survival, We had fought for a new beginning. The dawn came slowly, soft and hesitant, as if the world itself was recovering from the night's violence. The forest was quiet, the usual morning chorus muted by the weight of what had passed. I sat outside the cabin, the cool earth beneath me and the sharp scent of pine filling the air. My body ached in places I didn't know could hurt, and the scars on my arms stung with every movement. But it was the ache in my chest that cut deepest, the one carved by memories and loss, and the fragile hope now stirring inside me. Annabel appeared at the doorway, her face calm but tired. The scar that had once been a secret was now part of the story she wore proudly, a testament to the battles she'd fought, both seen and unseen. She sat beside me without a word, and for a while we simply watched the sun stretch its fingers through the trees, warming the cold earth. The war was over, or at least this chapter of it. Cutter was gone, his threat ended not by law or justice, but by our will to survive. But survival was only the beginning. Annabel reached into the small pack beside her and pulled out the faded scarf Josiah had given her. She held it delicately, the silk worn but still soft. "I never thought I'd want this," she said, voice low. "But maybe it's time I stopped hiding." I nodded, understanding what she meant. The scarf was more than fabric. It was a symbol of identity, of reclaiming what the world had tried to steal. Slowly she tied it around her head, the scar peeking out beneath the folds like a badge of honor. She caught my eyes and smiled, a small, genuine curve of lips that spoke of courage and quiet strength. For the first time since that auction stage, she looked at me fully, without walls or fear. "Thank you," she whispered. I shook my head, "No thank you." The days that followed were gentle and strange. We rebuilt the cabin, cleared the land, and planted seeds not just in the soil, but in our lives. Annabel found work with a small trading post in the next settlement, her skills and steady hands earning respect. I returned to the woods, felling timber with a renewed purpose, knowing I wasn't alone. But the past has a way of lingering, shadows stretching long across the present. One afternoon, a letter arrived, folded and creased, bearing the seal of a distant town. Josiah handed it to me, his eyes serious. It was from a lawyer, a note informing me of a claim on the land, a dispute that could strip away what we'd fought so hard to protect. The fight wasn't over, but this time we would face it not as broken souls, but as survivors, together. As I sat by the fire that evening watching Annabel laugh softly over a shared meal, I realized something that had been growing in my chest. She was no longer the woman I'd rescued for $2. She was the woman who had saved me. And whatever storms lay ahead, we would weather them side by side. The letter had settled over us like a cold fog, chilling the warmth we'd carefully nurtured. A legal claim on the land, a threat wrapped in ink and paper, but no less deadly than any bullet or blade. I held it in my hands countless times, the words blurring with each read, but the meaning never changing. They wanted to take it all away. The cabin, the trees, the fragile home we'd fought for with blood and sweat. Annabel sat beside me, eyes steady but somber. The scarf lay folded on the table between us, a silent reminder of how far she'd come and how far we still had to go. "We'll fight," she said, voice low but unwavering. "I know," I replied, "but this isn't like facing Cutter. This is the law, and law wears a different face." The next days were a whirlwind. We traveled to the nearest town, a dusty place with crooked streets and wary eyes. The lawyer who sent the letter was a man of sharp suits and sharper words, but his eyes flickered with something else, doubt, maybe respect. He explained the claim came from a wealthy timber company, hungry for the land we called home. Their lawyers were ready, backed by money and influence. But we had something they didn't, truth, and the scars to prove it. Annabel's story came out: the auction, the scars, the fight for survival. We presented the evidence. Josiah had gathered maps, testimonies from neighbors, and the token she'd left in that cave years ago. The courtroom was cold. The judge, an old man with weary eyes, The opposition was relentless, painting us as intruders, dreamers clinging to a fantasy. But as I watched Annabel speak, steady and clear, I saw the power in owning your story, not as a victim, but as a warrior. The days dragged on, tension mounting like the weight of a storm cloud ready to break. Then, on the final day, a breakthrough. The judge ruled in our favor. The claim was invalid, our right to the land upheld. Relief crashed over us like a tidal wave. Outside the courthouse, the sun broke through the clouds, warm and golden. We were free. But freedom wasn't just about land or law. It was about claiming who we were, scars and all. That evening, back at the cabin, Annabel finally removed the scarf, letting her hair fall free in the firelight. Her face, marked but unbowed, was the face of survival, strength, and hope. I took her hand, feeling the steady pulse beneath the rough skin. "We've come a long way," I said. She smiled, the kind of smile that held laughter, tears, and all the battles in between. "Yes," she said, "and the road ahead is ours to walk." Outside, the forest whispered its ancient songs, stories of endurance, of pain turned to power, of shadows chased away by light. And as the stars emerged, shining bright against the velvet sky, I knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, we would face it together. The first light of morning spilled softly across the horizon, brushing the tips of the towering pines with gold. It was the kind of dawn that felt like a promise, fragile yet unwavering. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with quiet, the stillness that comes only after storms and battles long fought. Annabel stood by the window watching as the world awoke, her silhouette framed by the rising sun. She had come so far from the woman who once hid behind a sackcloth, afraid of the world's judgment, to the fierce soul who faced shadows without flinching. I watched her from across the room, the weight of the past months settling into a steady calm. The land was ours, the threats behind us, but more than that, we had rebuilt something no force could touch. Hope. There was no grand speech or fireworks that morning, just the simple act of being two people who had chosen each other, scars and all, walking forward into whatever the future might bring. Annabel turned, a smile lighting her face that held no shame, only quiet strength. "It's time," she said softly. I knew what she meant. Time to shed the last layer of fear, to reveal fully the woman she had become. With steady hands, she reached up and pulled the scarf from her hair. It slipped away like a river flowing free, and beneath it, her scar was revealed, a jagged line, etched deep, but no longer a prison. She looked at me, eyes clear and bright. "I'm ready," she said. And with that, she stepped outside. The forest greeted her like an old friend, the sun warming her skin, the wind whispering through the leaves. For the first time in years, Annabel Crow walked without hiding. Neighbors who had once averted their eyes now stopped, their expressions shifting from suspicion to awe. They saw not a victim or a shadow, but a woman who had fought, survived, and claimed her place. Word spread slowly, like the turning of seasons, that the scarred woman with the fierce gaze was no longer a ghost but a guardian of the land, of the stories buried in its soil. I stood beside her, my own heart swelling with pride and something deeper love forged in the crucible of hardship. That evening, beneath a sky ablaze with stars, we sat by the fire. The forest hummed around us, alive with the songs of night creatures and the rustle of ancient trees. Annabel reached out, her fingers brushing mine. "We're home," she whispered. I nodded, the word carrying more weight than ever before. Home was not just the cabin or the land, it was this moment, this life we'd fought to claim. And as the firelight flickered over her face, I knew our story was not just about survival or scars. It was about rebirth, about the courage to face the darkness and choose the light, about love that sees beyond wounds and fear, embracing the whole, fierce, broken, and beautiful. The forest held us in its ancient embrace, a silent witness to a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, the future looked bright. If you were in his boots, would you fight the same fight? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and explore the other stories waiting for you on screen.